welcome back. So this is where we left off the last time, and we're still dealing with the basic configurations. Now, so let's set the variables used in the finished version. If you look at that finished version, you see that I have a white text here, an orange color, and this blue background. All those were saved in variables. So let's create them. So here, I color primary, which holds the value. I have color secondary, and this holds the orange color there. And I have color tertiary, and that holds. I also have color white, which obviously is FFF. I have color light gray, and that holds this value of 999. I have color dark gray also, 3, and that holds. And finally, I have a box shadow with an RGB value of 00 and a shadow of like so. So these are the variables declared or used in the finished version. Next, let's configure some basic setting. And to do that, I'll go to base.scss. Now, so here I'm going to set some general settings that pertains to all the pages if you had more than one of them. And one of it is the universal selector, the pseudo universal selector after, as well as the before. And what do I want here? I want a margin of 0, padding of 0, and I want the box sizing to be border box. I'm sure you understand what this property does. What it does is to ensure that when we add border and padding to an element, the value specified for the border and the padding do not add to the width specified for the item, but they are inclusive in the width defined for the item. So that's what this property does. Without it, if I declare an item to have a width of say 20 pixels and I declare a border of 2 pixels and a padding of maybe another 2 pixels, that's 2 plus 2, that's 4, plus the value I declare for the width. That will be the overall width of the element. But with this property, the 2 pixel border and the 2 pixel padding that I defined will be inclusive of the width for the item. So you don't have the item go beyond the value you define. That's what this property does. All right, so the next thing is our HTML, the root HTML. And this is where things become a little interesting. Here, it's where we're going to define the root font size. All right, but when we define it here, we're actually defining it relative to the one defined by the browser. And the value defined by the browser is 16 pixel. That's the absolute value defined by the browser. But here we're going to assign a relative value. And one of the units we could use for our relative values definition is rem or m, but I'm going to use the percentage. And the reason is because so that when the user alter the font size defined by the browser, and in one of the lessons, I actually show how that can be done. When the user does that, it will reflect on the site. And for that to happen, I can't afford to set the root font size here in pixel. I will have to do it in relative unit. And I choose the percentage here because that's a bit more flexible than choosing the rem or m. So here, the root font size that I want to define will be, I want a root font size of 75%. Now, if I define a root font size of 75%, what does this translate to in terms of pixel? Now, if we understand the fact that 1 rem is equals to 16 pixel and 100% is equals to 16 pixel. So if I say 75% here, so I'm saying 75% of 16 pixel. 75% of 16 pixel, what would it give me? If I do the mathematics, let's see what it gives us. So I want to calculate 75% of 16. And 75% there will be 0.75 times 16. That gives me 12. So that means 75% of 16 is 12 pixels. So it means that this value I define here is equivalent to 12 pixels. So this is the global font size that I want, all right? And everything that I define elsewhere will now be relative to this value. Okay, but this value of 75% that I defined, it's for the desktop version of my site. Don't forget that we're doing a desktop first. So this value is for the desktop version. Now, for the tab version, I will want a smaller font size, right? I want a smaller font size, say 10 this time around. So what it means is that I have to now set a different font size for the tab. And to do that, all I just need to do is to use my mixin that I defined in the previous lesson. And don't forget that mixin, we call it, what do we call it? We call it viewport at viewport. And this time we are calling that function because it's actually a function there. We are calling it and we are passing in the parameter this time around. Don't forget that when we define that mixin, this is it. When we define it with an argument called width. So now that we are, referencing that function or the mixin, we have to pass in the argument or the parameter this time around. Don't mind the difference between parameters and argument. The parameter is the actual value you pass in at the time you call the function. Argument is the placeholder you put in when you define the function. So this time around, I want to target the next after the desktop, and that's the landscape tab. So what I'll pass in here will be land type. And when I pass it in, what do I want to do? I want to now define the font size that I want in this case. The font size I want is 11 pixel. So what will now be 11 pixel, right? Let's do the calculation. So if I want 11 pixel, that should be 11, that should be 11 divided by 16. So let's see what that gives us first. Again, using my calculator, divided by 16, that gives me 0.68. So that is 68%. If you multiply that by 100, you see it gives us 68.75%, right? So it means that I will have 68.75% here. That's the font size for, give you a space here. That's the font size for land tab. That's tab in the landscape mode. And the next thing is, let me copy this and replicate for the next one. And this time around, this will be port. That's what I called it. Okay, port tab. This time I want 10 pixel here. So that means this one will be 10 divided by 16. Let's see what that gives us. 10 divided by 16. And that gives us 0.625. If I multiply that by 100, I get 62.5%. So that means I have 62.5% for the portrait tablet. All right. So, and with that, I have the font sizes for the different device width. The next thing I want to consider is some other HTML element that we want to define some basic value for or default values for. So here I have the body, for example. And for the body, here I can define a font family for the body, sans serif. And I also want to define a line height here in the body. And I want a line height of 1.2. Don't forget that line height has no unit. The next thing I want to configure is UL on order list. And don't forget, on order list has a default behavior of having the list item, take a disk. But this time around, I don't want that. So what I do is to say list style and set it to none. And if at any place in my project I want to have a list, I can just override this. Next, I want to handle the heading. So H1, H2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'll give them a common attribute. I'll say padding 1 rem up and down. That will be 16. Then 0 left and right. Here, if I want a different font size for headings as against the one I have for font family, I can also define it here, right? But let me leave that. Then another property I want here is overflow wrap, okay? And I want to set it to break word. Now, what does this property mean? What it means is if I have a word that is long such that it can overflow its container, rather than do that, let it break to the next line with a hyphen separating it. That's what overflow wrap does. Okay, so next is, now that I have defined the common properties I want for the headings, I want to also define individual property for heading 1, 2, and 3. So I want to call those heading primary. And what I want for this heading primary is that I want a font size of 2.5 rem. I want for heading secondary, I want a font size of 2 rem. Of course, depending on my design, these values can be overridden in different places. I also want heading tertiary. And finally, I want a heading, what I call heading sub. I give it a font size 1.2 after that. So this is just like my H1, and this will handle H2, H3, this H4. So the next is for paragraph, and so I call paragraph P main. So I'm going to declare a selector that I call P main, paragraph main, and here to define the values that I want. So I want a font size of 1.2 rem, one paragraph. And the same thing, that overflow wrap, I also want to define it for it, break word. Next, I want anchor. So I can put it here that this is paragraph. Anchor. So here I want a font size of 1.5. I want color of black, and I guess I have to define that here because I want to be able to control things globally. I want to call this color black. So color black, because this is an anchor, one of the default behaviors is to have an underline, so I'm going to take that off. So text decoration, I beg your pardon, set to none. And even in the hover state, I showed you how nesting worked before, so this shouldn't be strange to you. I also want to set that text decoration to none. And finally, at least for now, one other default configurations I like to have in my base setting is to target image. It's like video, SVG, canvas, and what else can I target there? SVG, canvas, it's called picture. I want to set all this to have a display of block, because by default they are not. And I want to set their max width to 100%, which means that they shouldn't go beyond the container in which I put them. So here are the default configurations that I want for this simple project. And this same configuration can be ported to your next project and so on. So you wouldn't need to create them multiple times. This is one of the reasons for this course. Actually, in the next lesson, we're going to set up perhaps the most important part of the configuration, and that's actually the reason why I primarily create this course, and that is creating utility styles.